So if you've been surfing the web for the last few weeks,
Surf the web, surf the web.
Shut up, Brock. We don't have time.
you'll have seen that 2 Spider-Man, 1 Venom released, and it's a pretty good game, and it really shows that Insomniac are probably some of the best developers that Sony has under their belt. And naturally, it's the world's most popular superhero, so it sold like 5 million units in 11 days, I think. And in case you weren't aware, it's a very good version of Spider-Man. Probably the best written version of Spider-Man we've had in years. And I want to get into a little bit of why I think that's the case. And speaking of getting into things, why don't you get into that like and subscribe button? It really helps out the video a bunch, and I'd love to see you back here again. So first off, Yuri Lowenthal and Najee Jeter each do really good work, especially when these characters get to interact with each other so much. Outside of the comics, there's not really a huge amount of material where Miles Morales and Peter Parker have interacted with each other. You have the Spider-Verse movies, you have a few animated cartoons, but it's not really the norm. And thanks to the success of Spider-Man PS4 and Spider-Man Miles Morales, and now Spider-Man 2, these actors' voices are becoming pretty synonymous with these characters. Like, it's very hard not to hear these actors' voices as these characters, which, like, they're really good voices. I don't hear them and think, man, they don't match. They're perfect. So that's first off. These characters have some great actors behind them that has helped bring them to life. And with the characters, there's a lot of history behind them. Peter Parker has 60 plus years of comic book history. Miles Morales has about 10 to 15 years of comic book history. And it feels like Insomniac are very aware of that. I think Insomniac were very tuned into the fact that a lot of people are familiar with the typical status quo of Peter Parker, that he has Mary Jane Watson in his life, that he's Spider-Man, he's having a tough time paying bills, etc., etc. And I think they really use that to their strength in terms of when the first game starts out, that's the status quo you're introduced to. Then as the game goes on, you're introduced to the standard array of villains. You have Kingpin, Scorpion, Rhino, Electro, you have a little bit of Norman Osborn in there. And any villains who the audience are typically aware of, they really put in the work to expand out those characters to make them a lot more interesting. The relationship between Peter Parker and Otto Octavius is fleshed out way more in the game compared to anything that we've seen in the comics. They're really doing their work to stretch out Norman Osborn becoming the Green Goblin. Kraven the Hunter is super interesting in Spider-Man 2. So I think they're very aware of knowing what's the status quo, and if something breaks the status quo, what to expand out on it. But then the stuff that's been introduced in like the last 15 years of the comics, they tend to put a little more focus on to expand out. For example, Feast is something that I think has only been introduced relatively recently. Mr. Negative is a character that was introduced, I think, in like 2007, 2008. Miles Morales' origin, he hasn't been in the comics nearly as long as Peter Parker. They really put in the legwork to expand on this stuff that's kind of recently been introduced to the comics that I think a lot of people wouldn't be as familiar with. For example, Miles Morales' origin. If you try to explain the comic book version of that, that's a mess. You have to just start going off and being like, okay, well, there's this thing called the Ultimate Universe. It's a parallel universe, and it's similar but different. And Peter Parker died, and then Miles Morales came in, and then they had an event called Secret Wars, and that merged the universes together. And then now Miles Morales is in the main universe, and like it's messy. And the third thing that I think really works to Insomniac's advantage is that obviously a lot of people are familiar with Spider-Man through the movies, but the movies have never really had a proper, fully experienced Spider-Man, like a Spider-Man that's been in play more than 2-3 years, whereas in Spider-Man PS4, I think he's been doing it for 5-6 years. I can't remember the exact number. So they kind of got to tread new ground in that way in terms of, hey, what does it look like for a Spider-Man who's experienced, who's learned to work it into his whole routine, who's managed to figure out how to pay bills, how to pay rent, how to do everything and juggle being Spider-Man as well. Insomniac kind of get to have their cake and eat it with regard to having the 2 Spider-Men in the game, because they have an experienced Peter Parker who has been doing it for years and he's managed to juggle everything. And even though his life doesn't quite go well, he's still got more of a handle on it than Miles Morales, who is like new to it. He needs a little more training, he's a little more nervous, but he's really trying to find his footing with everything. And they can play with both characters in that way, and how one character might impart their experience onto the other. I think that that's really interesting and probably quite fun for the writers to kick around. So yeah, it seemed like Insomniac really knew what they were doing when they decided to have a really experienced Spider-Man and an inexperienced Spider-Man, as part of their game universe. They get to play with all this new material. There's so much history behind all these characters, but they're also very aware of the history of both characters. And I think they're also aware of what the typical average Joe would know about Spider-Man versus what they wouldn't know, and what they need to expand on for this. Yeah, they seem to really have hit the nail on the head with a lot of this. They've created a great universe, and I'm looking forward to seeing more from Spider-Man. But also, I'm curious to see how they bring this experience to the Wolverine game, especially when I think that Wolverine hasn't quite had the same level of history that Spider-Man has had. Wolverine's a very popular character, mind you, but he doesn't quite have the rogues gallery that Spider-Man does. You know, you think of Wolverine, you think Sabretooth, Omega Red, maybe Mr. Sinister and Magneto. Like, that's it. Whereas Spider-Man has all these other villains. And I'm curious to see what they do with that. Whether they'll bring in more X-Men into the Wolverine game, or just... yeah, I don't know what they're going to do. But I think that they'll definitely have learned a lot of lessons from Spider-Man. And if they apply it to Wolverine, I think we'll get more good Marvel games from Insomniac. They're a really good developer.
Where'd Spider-Wars go? Spider-Wars! Come out and play!
Tag!